It was a quiet neighborhood, tucked away from the chaos of the city. Rows of modest houses lined the streets, each with neat lawns and picket fences. The kind of place where people exchanged polite nods but rarely delved into each other's lives. Life here was predictable, peaceful even, and for Mary Thompson, that was just how she liked it. At 74 years old, Mary had become a fixture in the community. With her silver hair tied neatly in a bun and her gentle smile, she gave off the air of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged content. Every morning, she could be found sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the world wake up around her. By afternoon, she was in her garden, tending to the flowers she cared for as if they were her children. And when evening came, she retreated to her cozy living room, a lamp casting a warm glow as she read from one of the many books lining her shelves. To the outside world, Mary seemed like any other elderly widow, living out her days quietly and without much fuss. Her neighbors often remarked on how serene she was, how unbothered by the hustle and bustle that sometimes seeped into their otherwise tranquil community. "She's such a sweet old lady," Mrs. Carter, who lived 2 doors down, often said. "Always smiling, always keeping to herself." But Mary was more than just the kind, elderly woman everyone thought they knew. Beneath her calm demeanor was a woman who had seen more than her share of hardships. She had lived through heartbreaks that would have crushed others, survived struggles that most couldn't imagine. Mary had learned to endure, to adapt, to persevere. Still, she never spoke of her past. It wasn't out of shame but out of choice. She preferred to leave those chapters of her life closed, focusing instead on the present. Life had taught her the value of silence, the power of observation, and the importance of choosing her battles wisely. The arrival of the new teens in town, however, would test her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. They appeared one summer afternoon, a group of 5, their laughter loud and careless as they roamed the streets. They were strangers to the neighborhood, their faces unfamiliar to the residents who had lived there for years. They had a certain swagger about them, the kind that came with youth and a sense of invincibility. At first, they were merely a curiosity. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the teens lingered on street corners, their voices carrying into the otherwise quiet air. They seemed harmless enough, just kids looking for something to do. But it didn't take long for their presence to stir unease. They began hanging out late into the night, their laughter turning into shouts, their innocent loitering evolving into something more disruptive. Trash bins were knocked over, cars were scratched, and the once peaceful streets began to feel less safe. Mary noticed them too. From her porch, she observed their antics with a calm expression, her hands wrapped around her teacup. She didn't say anything. She rarely did. But the teens noticed her as well. "Look at that old lady," one of them, a boy with a cocky grin, said as they passed her house one day. "Think she ever does anything but sit there," another chimed in, snickering. "She probably doesn't even notice half of what's going on," added a third, his tone mocking. Mary didn't react. She simply sipped her tea and watched them walk away, their laughter echoing down the street. But the teens weren't done with her. They saw her as an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back, who wouldn't even raise her voice. To them, Mary was just a frail old woman, someone they could mock and torment without consequence. And so, their focus shifted. At first, it was small things. A rock tossed into her yard, landing harmlessly among her flowers. A shout from the sidewalk, the words too garbled to understand but the tone unmistakably cruel. Mary didn't flinch. "She probably didn't even hear us," one of them said, laughing. But Mary had heard. She heard everything. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, they took things a step further. They approached her house, their voices hushed but filled with mischief. One of them, a girl with bright red hair, pulled out a can of spray paint. "Let's leave her a message," she said, grinning wickedly. The others laughed as they watched her scrawl hateful words across Mary's fence. They took pictures, their phones lighting up the growing darkness. When they were done, they stood back to admire their handiwork. "Perfect," the red-haired girl said, capping the spray can. "She's not even going to know what to do," the cocky boy added, his laughter ringing out as they walked away. The next morning, Mary stepped outside to find the graffiti on her fence. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she went back inside, returning minutes later with a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush. Her hands trembled as she worked, the effort of scrubbing away the paint evident in the lines of her face. But her resolve was steady. She didn't call out for help. She didn't complain. She simply did what needed to be done. Her neighbors watched from their windows, some shaking their heads in pity, others muttering about how someone should do something. But no one came to her aid. Mary didn't expect them to. She had long ago learned to rely on herself. The teens, meanwhile, felt emboldened. They saw her silence as weakness, her lack of reaction as permission to continue. "What's she going to do, call the cops?" one of them scoffed. "She's probably too scared," another said, laughing. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Little did they know, Mary Thompson was not as fragile as she seemed. The teens' confidence grew with each passing day. They loitered outside Mary's home, their voices loud and mocking, their laughter carrying a hint of malice. Her garden, once a sanctuary of vibrant colors and delicate fragrances, became a target. Flowers were trampled, pots were smashed, and the neatly trimmed hedges were kicked and left in disarray. "She won't even notice," one of them said, carelessly grinding his shoe into a patch of daisies. Mary did notice. Every broken stem, every crushed petal, every overturned pot, she noticed it all. But she said nothing. Instead, she quietly fixed what she could, replanting her flowers, replacing the pots, and trimming the hedges back into shape. Her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel the teens' cruelty. To them, her silence was an invitation to push further. Late one evening, as the stars twinkled above and the streetlights cast a soft glow over the neighborhood, the teens returned to her yard. This time, they came armed with more than just spray paint and mocking words. "Let's have some real fun tonight," the red-haired girl said, holding up a bag filled with cans of spray paint, rolls of toilet paper, and small firecrackers. The group cheered in agreement, their voices low but brimming with excitement. Mary, sitting by her window, watched as they crept onto her lawn. Her heart ached as she saw them toss toilet paper into the trees, spray obscene messages across her porch, and light firecrackers that left burn marks on her carefully tended grass. But she remained seated, her expression calm, her hands steady as they rested on her lap. The teens didn't realize they were being watched. They laughed and took videos, convinced that their actions would go unnoticed or unpunished. When they finally left, their laughter fading into the distance, Mary rose from her chair. She stepped outside, her slippers crunching softly against the grass. The mess they had left behind was extensive shreds of toilet paper fluttered in the breeze, the smell of burnt grass lingered in the air, and her once pristine porch was covered in hateful graffiti. Mary stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and went back inside. Mary Thompson was no stranger to challenges. Long before she had settled into this quiet neighborhood, her life had been anything but peaceful. She had grown up in a small town during a time when women were often dismissed, their voices silenced, their contributions overlooked. But Mary had always been different. As a young woman, she had worked tirelessly to support her family, juggling multiple jobs and facing discrimination at every turn. She had learned to navigate the world with quiet determination, using her sharp mind and unwavering resilience to carve out a life for herself. Later, when she married her husband, Charles, she thought she had found her forever partner. Together, they built a life filled with love and laughter. But tragedy struck when Charles passed away unexpectedly, leaving Mary to rebuild her life once again. Through it all, Mary had never lost her strength. She had faced loss, hardship, and injustice, but she had never let it break her. And now, as she stood in her vandalized yard, she felt that familiar resolve rising within her. The next morning, the neighborhood was abuzz with whispers. Word of the teens' latest antics had spread quickly, and many residents stopped by Mary's house to express their condolences or, at least, to satisfy their curiosity. "Those kids have gone too far this time," Mrs. Carter said, shaking her head as she peered at the graffiti on Mary's porch. "It's terrible, just terrible," added Mr. Daniels, who lived across the street. "Someone should really do something about this." But when it came time to act, the neighbors fell silent. They returned to their homes, shaking their heads and muttering about how awful it all was, but doing nothing to help. Mary didn't expect their assistance. She had learned long ago that relying on others often led to disappointment. Instead, she grabbed her cleaning supplies and set to work. As she scrubbed the graffiti from her porch and picked up the shredded toilet paper, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the teens' actions, it was about the message they were sending. They believed they could bully her, humiliate her, and get away with it. But Mary wasn't going to let that happen. Unaware of Mary's growing resolve, the teens were already planning their next stunt. They gathered in an abandoned lot on the edge of town, their voices filled with excitement as they brainstormed ideas. "She didn't even say anything after last night," the red-haired girl said, her tone smug. "It's like she doesn't even care. Or she's too scared to do anything," the cocky boy added, laughing. The others nodded in agreement, their confidence growing with each word. "Let's really mess with her this time," one of them suggested, pulling out a small notebook filled with ideas. "Something big, something she can't just clean up." They spent hours plotting, their laughter echoing in the empty lot as they finalized their plan. They didn't realize that their actions had consequences or that they were about to face them. That evening, as the sun set and the neighborhood grew quiet, Mary sat at her desk, a pen in hand and a notebook open before her. She wasn't planning revenge. Mary didn't believe in stooping to their level. But she was planning something. She wrote down every detail she could remember, the teens' faces, their voices, the times they had come to her house, and the damage they had caused. She made notes about their behavior, their actions, and their patterns. Mary also retrieved a small device from a drawer, a security camera she had purchased months ago but never installed. That night, under the cover of darkness, she set it up discreetly, ensuring it captured a clear view of her yard and porch. She wasn't going to confront the teens directly. Not yet. Instead, she was going to gather evidence, piece by piece, until she had everything she needed. As the days passed, Mary's neighbors began to notice a change in her. She was still the quiet, kind woman they had always known, but there was a newfound sense of purpose in her actions. "She's up to something," Mrs. Carter said, peering out her window as Mary adjusted her security camera. "Good for her," Mr. Daniels replied. "Those kids need to learn a lesson." But the neighbors still kept their distance, unwilling to get involved. Mary didn't mind. She had always been independent, and this was no different. She continued to tend to her garden, fix her porch, and clean up after the teens' latest stunts. But now, she did so with a quiet determination, knowing that her patience would soon pay off. It began with little things. A single rock, small and jagged, thrown carelessly into her flower bed. Mary noticed it immediately, lying there among her delicate lilies and daisies, its rough edges stark against the soft petals. She picked it up with steady hands, brushing off the dirt, and placed it quietly to the side. She didn't look around to see who had thrown it, though she could hear the faint laughter of the teens down the street. Instead, she focused on replanting the flowers they had disturbed, her resolve unshaken. Soon, the harassment grew louder. From the safety of distance, the teens began shouting cruel slurs as they passed her house. Their voices carried an edge of mockery, their words designed to sting. Yet Mary kept her head high, refusing to look up from her work in the garden or her book on the porch. Outwardly, she remained calm, unbothered, but inside she felt the familiar pang of frustration. She had lived through worse. These kids didn't know who she was or what she had endured. To them, she was just an old woman, fragile and inconsequential, someone they could ridicule without consequence. The attacks didn't stop there. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Mary sat inside reading, the teens struck again. They crept into her yard under the cover of dusk, their laughter muffled but unmistakable. Armed with spray cans, they scrawled hateful words across her once pristine white fence. Obscene phrases and crude drawings filled the wood, their marks harsh and bright against the gentle tones of her home. They filmed their handiwork, their faces lit by the glow of their phones, and congratulated each other on their cleverness. "She's not going to do anything," one of them said with a sneer, tossing the empty can onto her lawn. "What could an old woman like her even do?" The others laughed, their voices rising into the night as they disappeared down the street. The next morning, Mary stepped outside to find the vandalism waiting for her. The fence that had once framed her yard so neatly was now a canvas for cruelty. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes scanning the words and shapes that had been left behind. Her neighbors peeked from their windows, watching her reaction, but no one came out to help. Slowly, Mary turned and went back inside. Moments later, she returned with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff bristled brush. As she worked, her hands trembled from the effort. The spray paint didn't come off easily, and the scrubbing left her arms sore. Sweat trickled down her brow, and her breathing grew heavy, but she didn't stop. Her face, lined with age and wisdom, was set in quiet determination. Each stroke of the brush seemed to erase more than just the paint. It erased the sting of humiliation, the audacity of their actions, and the weight of the neighbor's silent judgment. Mary hadn't survived decades of hardship to let a group of teenagers break her spirit. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, losses that had left her reeling, battles that had tested her strength, moments when she thought she might not make it through. This, compared to all that, was small. Yet it wasn't insignificant. It was a reminder of how cruel people could be, how quick they were to underestimate her. Her neighbors' responses were as disheartening as the vandalism itself. Some turned a blind eye, pretending not to see the fence or hear the taunts that echoed down the street. Others shook their heads and muttered platitudes about how kids these days had no respect, but none of them stepped forward to help. They didn't offer to scrub the fence or even ask if Mary was all right. It was easier, after all, to stay inside and avoid getting involved. Mary didn't expect anything from them. She had learned long ago that people often looked the other way when faced with discomfort. It wasn't out of malice but fear of confrontation, of stepping out of their comfort zones. So, as always, Mary carried on. That night, she sat on her porch, her body aching from the day's labor. The fence was clean again, though faint traces of the graffiti remained, like shadows of the cruelty that had been inflicted on her. Mary sipped her tea slowly, her gaze fixed on the street where the teens had gathered just hours earlier. The air was cool and still, the neighborhood silent save for the chirping of crickets. Her calm exterior belied the storm brewing within her. She wasn't angry. Anger required too much energy, and Mary had learned to conserve hers for what truly mattered. But she was resolute. This couldn't continue. She didn't know what she would do yet, but she knew she wouldn't let them have the last word. The teens, emboldened by what they saw as her inaction, continued their campaign. They started sneaking into her yard at night, stealing garden tools and smashing flower pots. They laughed loudly as they passed her house during the day, taunting her with cruel nicknames and exaggerated imitations of her hunched posture. Each act of vandalism, Each hateful word felt like a challenge. Mary took it all in stride, her silence unnerving to those who watched from the sidelines. The neighborhood was beginning to murmur, their conversations laced with both admiration and pity. "She's so strong," some would say. Others whispered, "Why doesn't she just call the police?" But Mary knew better than to rely on others to fight her battles. She had always been her own strongest ally. One particularly dark night, the teens went too far. They threw bottles at her porch, shattering the glass and leaving shards scattered across the wooden planks. The sound echoed through the quiet street, startling the neighbors who had just settled in for the evening. Lights flickered on in nearby houses, and curtains shifted as people peered out to see what had happened. Mary stepped outside, barefoot and calm, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of her porch light. She looked at the mess, broken glass glittering like stars against the darkness, and then up at the street, where the teens stood laughing. They froze when they saw her, expecting her to yell or cry or retreat back into her house. But Mary simply stood there, her expression unreadable. The teens shuffled nervously, unsure of what to do. "Let's go," one of them muttered, and the group quickly dispersed into the shadows. Mary remained on the porch for a while, her gaze fixed on the spot where they had been. Then she turned and went back inside, closing the door quietly behind her. It was clear now. This wasn't just harmless fun, as the teens seemed to think. This was a deliberate attempt to break her, to make her feel small and powerless. But Mary wasn't powerless. She had faced bullies before in different forms and under different circumstances, and she had always found a way to rise above them. As the night deepened, Mary sat by her window, her hands resting on her lap. She thought of the challenges she had faced throughout her life, the battles she had fought and won. This was just another test, another opportunity to prove her strength. She wasn't sure what her next move would be, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't back down. Mary knew this had gone beyond simple mischief. This was deliberate cruelty, fueled by ignorance and an unearned sense of superiority. As she cleaned up the shards of glass from her porch the following morning, she moved slower than usual, her joints stiff from the effort. Her hands trembled slightly as she swept the pieces into a dustpan, their sharp edges catching the morning sunlight like tiny blades. But her mind was steady, focused. The neighbors watched her as they always did, some from behind curtains, others from their porches. Mrs. Patel, who lived across the street, finally stepped forward. She was a kind woman, though timid, and Mary often saw her in her garden with her young daughter. Clutching a tray of chai tea, Mrs. Patel hesitated at the edge of Mary's driveway. "Mrs. Thompson," she called softly. "Are you all right?" Mary looked up, her expression neutral. She wasn't used to her neighbors speaking up, much less offering help. "I'm fine, dear," she replied. "Just a bit of cleanup." Mrs. Patel hesitated, then took a step closer. "This has been happening a lot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The boys. They're causing so much trouble. Have you thought about calling the police?" Mary straightened, her back stiff but her presence commanding. "The police can't solve everything," she said evenly. "Sometimes, you have to handle things yourself." Mrs. Patel didn't push further, though her concern lingered in her eyes. She left the tray of tea on the porch and retreated to her home, casting one last worried glance over her shoulder. The day passed uneventfully, but Mary's mind churned with thoughts. She had no intention of letting this slide, but she also knew that confrontation alone wasn't the answer. These boys didn't fear consequences because they'd never faced them. They thought themselves invincible, their youth a shield against accountability. That night, Mary stayed up late, sitting by her living room window with a notebook in her lap. She began writing, her pen scratching steadily against the paper. She wrote down everything she had observed about the teens, their names, their routines, their actions. Mary had always been observant, a skill honed from years of working as a teacher. She remembered each face, each laugh, each time they passed her house with malice in their eyes. The teens, emboldened by what they saw as Mary's silence, struck again a few days later. This time, they lit firecrackers and threw them into her yard. The loud cracks startled her, sending birds fluttering from the trees. One of the firecrackers landed dangerously close to her flower bed, scorching the grass. Mary came outside moments later, her face calm but her eyes sharp. The teens, gathered at the corner of the street, watched her reaction with smug grins. "Look at her," one of them jeered. "She's too scared to do anything." Mary didn't respond. She simply picked up the remnants of the firecrackers, her hands steady despite the anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. The teens mistook her silence for weakness, but Mary was far from weak. Over the next few days, Mary began making quiet preparations. She visited the hardware store, purchasing materials that puzzled the young clerk who rang her up. She ordered items online, packages arriving discreetly on her porch. Mary worked late into the night, her small frame moving purposefully around her home. Meanwhile, the teens continued their campaign. They broke more pots, dumped trash into her yard, and even attempted to break one of her windows with a baseball. Each act was met with the same calm response from Mary. She cleaned up the messes, repaired what she could, and carried on as though nothing had happened. But Mary's composure wasn't the resignation of someone who had given up. It was the patience of someone waiting for the right moment. One afternoon, as the teens loitered near her house, Mary stepped outside with a small device in her hand. It looked like a simple camera, but it was far more advanced. Without a word, she raised it and took a photo of the group. The sudden click of the shutter startled them, and they scattered like startled birds. "What was that?" one of them shouted from a safe distance. Mary didn't reply. She simply went back inside, leaving the teens to wonder. The next day, Mary's fence bore a new addition, a small, weatherproof sign that read, "Smile, you're on camera." It was subtle, unassuming, but it sent a clear message. The teens laughed it off at first, calling her bluff. But when they returned that evening to throw eggs at her windows, they noticed something different. Small, discreet security cameras had been installed around the property. "She's trying to scare us," one of them said, though his voice wavered slightly. The group hesitated, their usual bravado faltering. They didn't realize that Mary had already captured clear images of their faces during their previous attacks. She had been documenting everything not just for her own protection, but to build a case against them. Mary's quiet strength began to shift the dynamic. The teens were no longer as confident, their laughter replaced by uneasy glances over their shoulders. Mary didn't need to yell or confront them directly. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. But Mary wasn't finished. She had one more plan in motion, something that would ensure the teens understood the gravity of their actions. It wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching them a lesson they wouldn't forget. The morning after their last attack, Mary made her way to the local community center. She had written a letter detailing the events of the past few weeks, including photos and timestamps from her security footage. She handed the letter to the center's director, a kind-hearted man who had known Mary for years. "This needs to be addressed," she said firmly. "These boys think they can act without consequences, but they're wrong." The director nodded, promising to take action. Mary trusted him to handle the situation fairly but firmly. Days passed, and the teens didn't return to Mary's house. Word had spread about the security cameras, and the group was beginning to feel the weight of their actions. They avoided her street altogether, their laughter replaced by silence whenever her name was mentioned. Mary, meanwhile, returned to her routine. Her garden began to recover, her fence repainted and whole once more. She continued to sit on her porch in the evenings, her presence a quiet reminder of the strength that had carried her through. Yet, deep down, Mary knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, a community's willingness to stand up against injustice, no matter how small. And while the teens might have retreated for now, she remained vigilant, ready for whatever came next. This chapter wasn't over. Mary was still writing her story, and she intended to finish it on her terms. The teens' boldness knew no limits. Emboldened by their past escapades, they escalated their mischief into outright destruction. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, the group gathered in front of Mary's house with a new plan, one that crossed every boundary of decency. "She's probably asleep," one of them whispered, smirking as he held up a crowbar. Another teen, a girl wearing a hoodie pulled low over her face, laughed nervously. "You sure about this? Feels kinda extreme." "Come on," the leader snapped. "She's just some old lady. What's she gonna do? Call the cops? By the time they show up, we'll be long gone." Their laughter broke the stillness of the night as they shattered one of Mary's front windows with a heavy rock. The glass rained down onto her living room floor, the sound sharp and jarring. It echoed through the quiet neighborhood, but no lights flickered on in Mary's home. Inside, the group moved quickly, overturning furniture, pulling books from shelves, and ripping apart cushions. One boy kicked over a table, scattering Mary's neatly stacked magazines. Another picked up a framed photo of Mary and her late husband, smashed the glass, and tossed it aside. "This place is a dump," one of them sneered as he panned his phone's camera across the scene. "Old people and their ugly furniture." They posted their antics online that same night, tagging it with hashtags meant to draw attention. At first, the comments were from their peers' encouragement, laughter, and emojis of approval. But as the hours passed, a different kind of comment began to appear. "Why would you do this? Do you realize how awful this is? This isn't funny. It's criminal." By morning, the video had gone viral. What they had expected to be a moment of infamy turned into public outrage. People recognized Mary's home. Some even identified the teens by their voices and faces, despite the hoodies and masks. But the teens, oblivious to the growing backlash, celebrated their perceived victory. To them, the silence from Mary's house was proof that they had won. Mary, however, was not home that night. She had left hours before, a quiet decision that was anything but accidental. For weeks, she had been watching the teens, observing their behavior, and piecing together their patterns. Her instincts told her they would escalate, and so she had made her house ready. The morning after the break-in, Mary returned to a scene of chaos. The furniture she had carefully maintained over the years lay overturned. The cushions she had stitched herself were torn and scattered. Even the photos of her late husband had been vandalized. Mary stood in the doorway, taking it all in with an unsettling calm. She didn't cry or scream. Instead, she methodically began to clean up, starting with the broken glass. By noon, the house was tidied, though it bore the scars of the invasion. Mary took a deep breath, sat at her kitchen table, and made several phone calls. The first was to a local locksmith to reinforce her doors and windows. The second was to a tech company she had worked with weeks earlier. Quietly, and with little fanfare, Mary had installed a series of hidden security cameras throughout her property. Every moment of the teens' break-in had been recorded in high definition, capturing not only their faces but their voices as well. That afternoon, Mary compiled the footage onto a flash drive and slid it into an envelope. She included a typed letter detailing the events of the past few months, along with the names of the teens she had identified. Mary had once been a schoolteacher, and her meticulous attention to detail shone through in the organized documentation. But she wasn't finished. As evening fell, Mary sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. Social media, something she had once dismissed as a young person's game, had suddenly become her ally. She found the video the teens had posted and began reading the comments. Many were filled with outrage, while others expressed sympathy for her situation. Mary's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could have responded with anger, with accusations, or even with tears. But instead, she typed a single message. "Thank you to those who showed kindness and concern. To the rest, you'll hear from me soon." Her words were calm, measured, and deliberate, a reflection of the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. The post gained attention almost immediately. People began sharing it, tagging news outlets and community leaders. Mary's quiet resilience became a symbol of strength, and the teen's arrogance began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Mary continued her preparations. She contacted a lawyer to ensure her case was airtight. She spoke to a friend at the local newspaper, who promised to run a story highlighting not only the break-in but the ongoing harassment she had endured. The teens, unaware of the storm they had unleashed, continued to roam the neighborhood, though their bravado was beginning to fade. The backlash online was harder to ignore, and whispers of legal consequences had begun to reach their ears. One evening, as they passed Mary's house, they noticed something different. The lights inside were on, and a faint silhouette could be seen through the curtains. A small sign had been placed in the front yard. "Justice is coming." It was simple, understated, and deeply unsettling. "What does that even mean?" one of the teens muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Who cares?" another said, trying to laugh it off. "She's just bluffing. She can't do anything." But they were wrong. Mary's patience had limits, and those limits had been reached. What the teens didn't know was that their every action had been documented, their every move anticipated. Mary was no longer just reacting to their behavior, she was preparing to end it once and for all. As the days passed, the teens began to feel the weight of their choices. Their names circulated through the community, whispered in disapproval by neighbors who had once ignored their antics. Their video, once a source of pride, had become evidence of their guilt. Mary's calm resolve had turned the tide. The once overlooked woman had become a force they couldn't ignore. And though they didn't yet know how it would unfold, the teens could sense that their time was running out. What had begun as a cruel game was now spiraling out of their control. Mary's silence was no longer a sign of weakness, it was the quiet before the storm. And the storm was coming. The days dragged on, each one quieter than the last. Mary's house, once a target for the teens' wild antics, seemed different now. They noticed subtle changes that made them uneasy: new lights installed above the doors, faint buzzing sounds hinting at cameras, and Mary's calm but focused presence. "She's up to something," one of the teens muttered one afternoon as they gathered on the sidewalk a few houses away. "She's bluffing," another insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "What can she even do? We're minors." "Yeah, but people are starting to talk," a girl whispered, lowering her hood as if to hide her face. "Have you seen the comments online? They know it's us." Their leader, Jason, waved it off, though even he couldn't ignore the nagging worry creeping into his mind. "Let them talk. No one's going to care about some old ladies whining. Besides, we're the ones with the video proof. She doesn't have anything on us." But Jason was wrong. Mary had more than enough evidence, and her plan was moving forward, piece by piece. Every phone call she made, every meeting she attended, was carefully orchestrated to ensure that when the time came, there would be no escape for the teens who had tormented her. She started small, enlisting the help of her neighbors. Some had stayed silent out of fear or indifference, but as Mary shared her story showing them the footage of the teens invading her home, their attitudes began to change. "I didn't realize it had gotten so bad," one neighbor admitted, guilt evident in her voice. "I thought it was just harmless pranks." "It's not harmless," Mary said firmly. "It's destruction. It's harassment. And it needs to stop." Soon, the neighborhood was rallying around Mary. People who had once turned a blind eye began installing their own cameras, watching the streets more closely, and reporting any suspicious activity. The teens, once emboldened by the lack of consequences, now found themselves watched at every turn. One evening, as Jason and his group wandered the neighborhood, they noticed something unusual: no one was outside. Porch lights flickered on as they passed, curtains shifted as neighbors peeked out, but no one engaged with them. "It's like they're avoiding us," one of the teens whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They're scared of us," Jason said, trying to maintain his bravado. "That's a good thing." But deep down, Jason knew better. The silence wasn't fear, it was preparation. Mary, meanwhile, was laying the groundwork for the next phase of her plan. With the help of her lawyer, she compiled a formal report to present to the police. The evidence was damning: detailed logs of every incident, high-quality video footage of the break-in, and witness statements from neighbors who had finally stepped forward. When Mary handed the envelope to the officer at the local station, her hands were steady. "I've done my part," she said simply. "Now it's time for justice to do its." The officer nodded, flipping through the documents. "We'll take it from here, ma'am. And I'll make sure this is handled properly." Word of Mary's actions spread quickly. The teens, once cocky and untouchable, began to feel the walls closing in. Their parents were called to meetings with school officials, local reporters began asking questions, and the police showed up at their homes with warrants. "What's happening?" Jason's mother demanded one evening, her voice sharp with panic. "Why are the police here? What did you do?" Jason tried to play it cool, shrugging off her questions. "It's nothing. They're just overreacting." But as the officers laid out the evidence, his confidence crumbled. The videos they had so proudly shared were now being used against them, every frame a testament to their crimes. Mary, however, was not content to let the legal system handle everything. She knew that true justice required more than just punishment, it required understanding. One evening, she invited a reporter into her home. The woman, a young journalist eager to make her mark, listened intently as Mary recounted her story. "They thought I was weak," Mary said, her voice calm but firm. "They thought my age made me an easy target. But what they didn't understand is that age isn't a weakness, it's a strength. I've lived through things they can't even imagine. And I've learned that sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most." The article was published the next day, complete with photos of Mary's home before and after the break-in. It went viral within hours, drawing support from people around the world. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, offering to help repair the damage and stand by Mary's side. The teens, meanwhile, found themselves isolated. Their friends distanced themselves, their reputations in ruins. Even their families, once dismissive of Mary's complaints, began to feel the weight of their children's actions. Jason, desperate to salvage what little dignity he had left, decided to confront Mary directly. Late one evening, he knocked on her door, his hands stuffed into his pockets. When Mary answered, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read: calm, knowing, and unshaken. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady. Jason hesitated, his usual swagger gone. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Mary didn't respond right away. She studied him, her piercing gaze making him shift uncomfortably. Finally, she said, "Sorry isn't enough, Jason. Not this time. But if you're truly sorry, you'll do the work to make it right." Jason nodded, swallowing hard. "I will. I promise." "Good," Mary said, stepping back to close the door. "Because if you don't, I'll be watching." As the door clicked shut, Jason stood on the porch for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he understood that Mary was not just an old woman. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had already won. Mary let the silence stretch, her gaze steady and unyielding. The parents of the teens, seated on one side of the room, whispered among themselves, their anger and disbelief evident. Some glared at their children, while others looked helpless, unable to comprehend how things had spiraled so far. "Do you think this was fun?" Mary asked, her voice cutting through the tense air. "Spray painting hate on my fence, shattering the memories I built in my home, filming it for the world to see? Did it make you feel powerful?" Jason, usually the loudest of the group, sat frozen. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a fear he couldn't mask. The other teens avoided Mary's eyes, staring at the ground as if they could sink into it. "You thought I wouldn't fight back," Mary continued, pacing slowly across the room. "You thought I was too old, too weak, too alone. But let me tell you something about me." She stopped, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've survived more than you'll ever know. And I didn't survive all that to let a bunch of bored teenagers tear me down." Mary paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was silent except for the faint sound of someone shifting nervously in their seat. Then, she reached into a bag and pulled out a thick folder. She held it up for everyone to see. "In this folder is every piece of evidence against you," she said, addressing the teens directly. "Every action, every word, every crime. It's all here. And I've made sure it's in the hands of people who will take it seriously." One of the parents stood, her face pale but determined. "Mary, please," she said, her voice trembling. "They're just kids. They didn't mean." Mary held up a hand, silencing her. "They're old enough to know right from wrong," she said firmly. "They chose to target me. They chose to destroy my property. And they chose to laugh while doing it. Intent matters, and so do consequences." The parent sank back into her seat, her eyes filling with tears. But Mary wasn't done. She looked at the teens again, her expression softening just slightly. "You're young," she said. "You made terrible choices, but this doesn't have to define you. What happens next is up to you." The teens glanced at each other, confusion flickering across their faces. "You'll be facing charges, yes," Mary continued. "But I've spoken to the authorities about an alternative path. Community service. Mandatory counseling. Restitution for what you've destroyed. Restitution." Jason finally croaked, his voice shaking. "Yes, Jason," Mary replied sharply. "You'll be cleaning up my property, repairing what you broke, and learning firsthand what it means to fix something you destroyed." The other teens began murmuring among themselves. One of them, a girl named Hannah, raised her hand hesitantly. "Does this mean we won't go to jail?" Mary's gaze softened slightly. "That depends on you," she said. "This is a chance to make things right. But it's your last chance. If you mess up again, I won't hold back." The teens nodded, their bravado completely stripped away. Then Mary turned to the parents. "I've also asked for a restorative justice program. It's not just the kids who need to learn, it's all of us. We need to come together as a community to ensure this doesn't happen again. Ignoring it or excusing it won't help anyone." Several parents nodded, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. As the meeting ended, the teens shuffled out, quieter than they'd ever been. Jason lingered behind, avoiding Mary's gaze until she spoke directly to him. "Jason," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. He looked up, his face a mixture of shame and fear. "Yes, ma'am." "You're their leader," Mary said simply. "Start acting like one for the right reasons this time." Jason swallowed hard and nodded. "I will," he said softly. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The teens were assigned to community service, starting with cleaning Mary's yard and repainting her fence. Jason was the first to show up, bucket and brush in hand, his face set with grim determination. At first, it was awkward. The teens worked in silence, their discomfort palpable. But as the days went on, something began to shift. They started to talk not just about what they were doing, but about why they had done it in the first place. "I don't even know why we started this," Hannah admitted one day as she pulled weeds in Mary's garden. "It was just something to do." Jason nodded, his hands smudged with paint. "Yeah. It was stupid. We didn't think about how it would affect anyone." Mary, who was supervising from her porch, spoke up. "You're thinking about it now," she said. "That's what matters. Change starts with understanding." Bit by bit, the teens began to open up, sharing stories of their own struggles and fears. They weren't just bullies, they were kids looking for an outlet, for something to make them feel important. And Mary, ever patient and wise, listened. By the time their community service was complete, the teens were different. They had learned the value of hard work, of taking responsibility for their actions, and of respecting others. Mary's house, once a symbol of their misdeeds, now stood as a testament to their growth. The fence was repainted, the garden restored, and the windows replaced. But the biggest change was in the teens themselves. At the final meeting with the community, Jason stood and addressed the room. "We messed up," he said, his voice steady. "We hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But thanks to Mary, we've learned that we can be better. And we will be." The room erupted in applause, but it was Mary's quiet smile that meant the most. As the teens left that day, Mary watched them go, a sense of peace settling over her. They had a long way to go, but she knew they were on the right path. And as for Mary, she returned to her porch, her book, and her tea, knowing that sometimes, the strongest act of resistance is simply refusing to give up. The teens thought their ordeal was over, but Mary had one final lesson planned. After their community service concluded, she invited them all over for tea. It was an odd request, and at first, none of them wanted to go. Jason even muttered, "What now? More lectures?" But their parents insisted. When they arrived, the teens were greeted not with stern looks or cold warnings but with a warm table set on Mary's back porch. The scent of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air. A pitcher of iced lemonade stood in the center, alongside an arrangement of small sandwiches and fruit. Hannah was the first to speak. "This doesn't feel like a punishment." Mary chuckled softly, motioning for them to sit. "It's not. You've done the work, and I can see the changes in you. This is something different. Sit down, and let's talk." Cautiously, they obeyed, unsure of what to expect. "I want to tell you a story," Mary began, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "It's about someone who was once just like you." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Like us?" Mary nodded. "Yes. A young person, full of anger, making choices without thinking of the consequences. Someone who didn't understand how their actions affected others." The teens leaned in, curious despite themselves. This person hurt others not physically, but with words and actions. They thought they were invincible, that the world owed them something. But one day, they went too far. They hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Mary paused, her eyes distant as if she were seeing the events unfold all over again. "What happened to them?" Hannah asked hesitantly. "They lost everything," Mary replied. "Respect, opportunities, friends. It wasn't until they hit rock bottom that they realized how wrong they had been. It took years to rebuild, to make amends, and to become someone they could be proud of." Jason frowned. "Why are you telling us this?" Mary met his gaze. "Because that person was me." The table fell silent. "You?" Hannah whispered, her eyes wide. Mary nodded. "I wasn't always the woman you see now. I made my share of mistakes, and I paid for them. But I learned, and I grew. And that's why I believe in giving people second chances, because someone once gave me one. The teens were stunned. They had seen Mary as a victim, a fragile old woman who needed their help. But now, they saw her differently. She was someone who had walked a harder road than they could imagine and had come out stronger on the other side. Jason cleared his throat. So, all this, everything you made us do, was your way of giving us a second chance. Mary smiled softly. Exactly. You've shown me you're capable of more than the mistakes you made. I wanted you to see it for yourselves. The teens exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of guilt and gratitude. But there's one more thing I want to ask of you, Mary said, her tone serious again. What's that? Jason asked, his voice cautious. I want you to take what you've learned and use it, Mary said. Be better to the people around you. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And if you see someone going down the wrong path like you did, stop them. Hannah nodded. We can do that. Jason leaned forward. We will do that. Mary's smile widened. Good. Because the real test of character isn't how you fix your mistakes, it's how you move forward. In the months that followed, the teens began to live up to their promise. Jason joined a local youth group and started mentoring younger kids, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Hannah organized a community cleanup day, enlisting her friends and neighbors to beautify the town. Even the other teens, who had been quieter during the ordeal, found their own ways to contribute. One started volunteering at the local animal shelter, another began working with a group that supported elderly residents. Mary watched their progress from afar, her heart swelling with pride. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for them, but she also knew they had the strength to navigate it. One day, Jason stopped by her house unannounced. He carried a small box, which he handed to her with an awkward smile. What's this? Mary asked, peering inside. Well, it's something we all chipped in for, Jason said, scratching the back of his neck. You know, to say thank you. Inside the box was a delicate ceramic figurine of a woman holding a bouquet of flowers. The inscription at the base read, "For someone who plants seeds of kindness, and helps them grow." Mary's eyes glistened as she looked up at Jason. This is beautiful. Thank you. Jason shrugged, his cheeks turning red. We just wanted you to know we're grateful. For everything. Mary placed the figurine on her mantel that evening, next to the framed photos they had helped her restore. For the first time in a long while, her house felt like home again. Years later, when Mary's story was retold in the neighborhood, it became more than just a tale of resilience and justice. It became a story of transformation, of how a single act of courage could ripple outward and change lives. And for those teens, now young adults, the lessons Mary taught them stayed with them. They carried her words in their hearts, using them as a guide to navigate their own lives. Because sometimes, the greatest lessons don't come from punishment. They come from understanding, compassion, and the willingness to believe in the power of redemption. The fallout was swift and unavoidable. News of the teens' behavior spread throughout the small town, and soon, their faces were plastered across local social media groups. Their parents, mortified by what their children had done, faced the shame head-on. One by one, each teen was escorted to Mary's doorstep by their parents, eyes cast downward, voices shaky with guilt. They each gave her a formal apology, some even struggling to hold back tears. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We never should have done any of that." Mary listened quietly, her expression calm but unreadable. She nodded after each apology, her silence more powerful than words. But this was not the end of their reckoning. The video evidence Mary had shared with the police led to charges of vandalism, trespassing, and property damage. The teens were summoned to court, where they faced a stern judge who did not mince words. This behavior is not just reckless, the judge said firmly. It's hateful and unacceptable. You've disrespected not only an elderly woman who has done nothing to harm you but also the values this community stands for. The ruling was clear. The teens were sentenced to extensive community service and mandatory counseling sessions focused on empathy and accountability. Additionally, they were required to pay restitution for the damages to Mary's property. But Mary had other plans. Rather than accepting the restitution directly, she insisted that the funds go towards something bigger. With the help of a few neighbors who had finally stepped up to support her, Mary launched a community fundraiser. The money won't just fix my home, she announced during a local event. It will fix something deeper. We need to address the lack of kindness and understanding that allowed this to happen in the first place. Her words struck a chord. Donations poured in not just from the neighborhood but from strangers who had read about her story online. Within weeks, Mary had raised enough to not only repair her home but to create a small community program aimed at teaching young people about the impact of their actions. The program, called Planting Seeds of Kindness, was run out of the local community center. It offered workshops, guest speakers, and activities focused on empathy, kindness, and community service. Ironically, the teens who had vandalized Mary's home were some of the first participants. Part of their community service involved helping to set up the program and working with younger kids who looked up to them. At first, the teens were reluctant. Jason grumbled about being forced to participate, and Hannah rolled her eyes during the first few workshops. But as they spent more time interacting with the program, something began to shift. One day, during an art session where kids were painting flower pots, Jason found himself smiling as he helped a little boy mix colors. "Why are you doing this for us?" the boy asked, his curious eyes fixed on Jason. Jason hesitated, then replied, "Because I made some bad choices, and I want to do better now." Meanwhile, Mary's garden became a symbol of resilience and unity. With the help of her supportive neighbors, she restored the space to its former beauty and more. Vibrant flowers filled every corner, and a small wooden bench was added beneath the oak tree in her yard. A plaque was mounted near the bench, inscribed with the words, "Kindness grows here. Hate cannot bloom where love is planted." The garden became a gathering spot for the community. Neighbors who had once been distant now came together for tea, chats, and laughter under the shade of Mary's oak tree. Even the teens found themselves returning to the garden, not out of obligation but because they had grown to care for it and for Mary. One evening, after a long day of community service, Jason lingered by the garden gate. "Mrs. Thompson," he said hesitantly, "do you really forgive us?" Mary looked up from her watering can, her eyes soft. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to believe in the possibility of change. And yes, Jason, I forgive you." Mary's story didn't just resonate within the neighborhood, it went viral. A local journalist picked up on the fundraiser and the community program, and soon national outlets were sharing her journey. She was invited to speak at schools, community events, and even a televised town hall. Everywhere she went, she carried the same message. Kindness is a choice, and so is cruelty. We all have the power to decide which one we plant in the hearts of those around us. Her resilience inspired countless others. Letters poured in from people who had experienced similar hardships, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own stories of triumph over adversity. But the most remarkable transformation was in the teens themselves. By the end of their community service, they were no longer the same people who had caused so much pain. Hannah started volunteering regularly at the community center, mentoring younger kids and sharing her story as a warning about the consequences of thoughtless actions. Jason, who had once been the ringleader, took it upon himself to organize neighborhood cleanups and other community projects. He even approached Mary one day with an idea. "Do you think we could turn part of the garden into a learning space?" he asked. "Like, a place where kids can come and learn about kindness and stuff." Mary smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea, Jason. As the years passed, the community transformed. What had once been a quiet, disconnected neighborhood became a vibrant hub of activity and support. And at the center of it all was Mary, tending her garden with a peaceful smile. Her house, once vandalized and broken, now stood as a beacon of hope and unity. The marks of hate had long been washed away, replaced by the flourishing blooms of love and resilience. For Mary, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about growth, redemption, and the enduring power of kindness. The day was bright, the air crisp with the promise of change. Mary stood in front of her fence, now a masterpiece of colors and hope. The fence that had once been marred by hate was now painted with a mural of blooming flowers, rising birds, and rays of sunlight. It was a symbol of growth, renewal, and the strength of the human spirit. A crowd had gathered in her yard, some neighbors, some friends, and even a few of the teens who had once tormented her, their faces no longer filled with defiance but with reflection. Mary looked at the mural, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the flowers in the paint. The vibrant colors caught the sunlight, as if the fence itself was alive with possibility. A few feet away, the teens stood together. Jason, now taller and stronger in character, watched her closely. He had been the most stubborn of them all, the one who had started it all, but now, his face showed the quiet understanding that had come over him in the past months. Hannah, too, stood beside him, no longer the girl who had mocked Mary, but someone who had learned to appreciate the lessons life had offered. The other teens, once careless and reckless, now appeared thoughtful. There was no more sneering, no more arrogance. The once cruel laughter had turned into quiet reflection, each of them in their own way understanding the depth of their past mistakes. The community had shown them a path of accountability, but it was Mary who had taught them that true strength wasn't about being loud or imposing, it was about choosing kindness, standing firm for what was right, and never letting the world's hate get the better of you. Mary turned to face the crowd, her posture straight and dignified. The crowd had come to witness the unveiling of the mural, but they had come for something more. They had come for the wisdom that Mary had earned through a lifetime of challenges, a wisdom that had transformed not just her life but the lives of those around her. Her voice, though gentle, carried with quiet power. Kindness is not weakness, she said, looking around at the group before her. Kindness takes strength. It takes a strength that doesn't shout to be heard but speaks in quiet moments of grace. It takes courage to do the right thing, even when it feels like the world is against you. The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. The mural behind her seemed to come alive, almost as though it too was listening, witnessing the moment. Mary's words were simple, but they were powerful. She paused, letting the weight of her statement sink in. And standing up for what's right, she continued, her eyes meeting those of the teens. That's a strength no one can take away. Jason looked down, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He thought back to all the times he had laughed at Mary, all the times he had taken the easy path, the path of cruelty and thoughtlessness. He had never understood that kindness was not something you did because you had to, but because it made you stronger. He had never understood that standing up for what was right didn't always mean fighting with your fists. It could mean standing quietly in the face of wrong and refusing to be moved. Hannah, standing next to him, had her hands folded together. She remembered the moment when Mary had forgiven her, when Mary had opened her home and her heart even after all the pain the teens had caused her. It had been hard to believe at first, that someone could be so strong, so generous in spirit. But now, as she looked at Mary, she saw it clearly. Strength wasn't about power or force. It was about having the courage to be kind, the courage to apologize when you're wrong, and the courage to help others when you can. The once silent neighbors, many of whom had stayed away during the dark days of the vandalism, now nodded in agreement. Some of them had even been part of the fundraiser that had restored Mary's home. They had helped build the mural, too. It was as much a symbol for them as it was for Mary, a symbol that their community had found a new strength in kindness and togetherness. Mary had not only restored her home but had helped rebuild the spirit of the town. It wasn't just about the damage that had been done to her property, it was about the damage that had been done to the heart of the community. Now, that heart was beating stronger than ever, and everyone could feel it. As the crowd began to disperse, many of the teens stayed behind. Jason approached Mary, this time not with hesitation but with respect. "You were right," he said quietly, "about everything. About kindness, and about strength. I never thought about it like that." He paused, looking down at his shoes for a moment, unsure of how to express what he was feeling. "I'm sorry, Mary. I really am." Mary smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know you are, Jason. And that's what matters. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning from your mistakes and doing better next time." Hannah stepped forward, her voice a little shakier than Jason's. "Mary, I don't know if I can ever make up for what we did to you. But I want to try. I want to help make this town a place where people like you are never hurt again." Mary's heart swelled. "You've already made a start, Hannah. You've learned the lesson. Now, it's up to you to carry it forward." And that was the moment. The moment when the teens, the neighbors, and Mary herself realized that true power came not from revenge or retaliation, but from the quiet strength of choosing kindness even when the world seems to give you every reason not to. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across the mural, Mary looked around at the people who had gathered. Her neighbors, who had once been afraid to speak up, were now standing taller, their voices clear and strong as they joined together to support one another. This was justice, but it wasn't the kind that came from courts or punishment. It was the justice that came from change. From growth. From understanding. True power comes from the quiet resolve of those who refuse to break, Mary thought, her heart full of hope for the future. She had faced darkness and emerged stronger. And now, the community that had once turned its back on her was united in a way they never had been before. She looked one last time at the mural, at the vibrant flowers that symbolized not just her resilience, but the resilience of everyone who had come together to rebuild. It was a symbol of the future, a future where kindness and strength would grow together, side by side. And in that moment, Mary knew that the lesson she had taught, the lesson of kindness, strength, and the courage to stand up for what's right, would live on in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed this story. The teens who had once mocked her, the neighbors who had stood by in silence, and even the strangers who had heard her story, they would all carry it forward. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can plant the seeds of the greatest change. As Mary smiled, watching the sunset cast its soft light across the mural and the garden, she knew one thing for sure: the power of kindness was the most lasting power of all.